invited Marsh Davis, the president of Historic Landmarks Foundation of Indiana, to come down today to tell us what we're going to have to do, the responsibilities we're going to have to meet as a community to retain our National Historic Landmark District designation. This is going to be a community effort. It's going to involve all of us, and Marsh is here to tell us what we're going to have to do. Oh, okay.
See if that works. Oh, wait a minute.
Nah, that's okay. Before we get started with the real program today, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce to you the historic, or the Cornerstone board members. I don't think we've ever, in any of our presentations, given recognition to those of us who put these programs together. So, for your information, I'd like to introduce my vice president, Brad Miller, who is at the back of the room. Next to him is our secretary, Ruth Murray. Meredith Gregg is seated in the back row here, is our treasurer, publicity chairman, newsletter editor, you name it, Meredith does it. We'd be lost without her. And we have two more board members. We have Connie Partington and Heidi Sauersig. I'm told there are two pronunciations of this name, and I'm using the German pronunciation. I can't tell you what the anglicized version is. This is my team, and I'm proud of them. I'm proud of the work that we've managed to get done in the last year and a half or so. We have some more ideas and plans for things to come in the future, and you'll be hearing about those as we're ready to announce them. Now that you know us, I'd like to learn a little bit about you. Just by show of hands, how many of you are Cornerstone members? Not bad. Very good. Thank you all for turning out. And since you are here, I'm going to ask a favor of you. Because it's a requirement of our charter, we have to have an annual election of board members. So we have a ballot and a ballot box on the back table back there. I'm going to ask all of you Cornerstone members to complete one of those ballots before you leave today and drop it in the box. It's just that simple. And if any of you would be interested in joining us as board members, think you have something to offer, please let us know about it. We'd welcome more help. Now, how many members do we have here from HMI? Good again. Wonderful. Main Street program. Okay. Historical Society. All right. Very good. Now, some of the more, well, the people that play vital roles in maintaining our historic district serve in our local government. We have in our audience Mayor Al Huntington with us today. Obviously, a major part of the effort falls on the Historic Review Board members. Would those of you who are in our audience today please raise your hand? Okay, do we have any city council members here? Okay. How about county commissioners? Okay. Maybe too much to ask for, but we could hope. Now, anybody who hasn't raised their hand yet, please do so our membership chairman can see you after the meeting.
My sister visiting from Vancouver, Washington.
Okay, very good. Thank you for coming. I think you get the award for the greatest distance traveled. Now, again, before we get started with the program, normally when there's going to be a presentation for the keynote speaker, it takes place at the end of the presentation. Well, because of the way things work out today, we're going to turn that around and actually present Marsh Davis today with his token of appreciation before he gives his presentation. And for that presentation, since this is really, it's turned into another collaborative effort between the Main Street program and Cornerstone, unwittingly, I'd like to ask Nancy Gruner, president of Main Street, and Bob Sauersig to come up here and help with the presentation to Marsh. And Marsh will have to come up here too.
We're going to make this short and sweet because we want to hear what you have to say. With kindred spirits, thank you for letting us join you. We want to give Marsh this plaque, a poster of the Main Street Madison that's produced. Larry Hunt is the photographer. He's the one that put this whole thing together and donated it to the Main Street program. You're the recipient of the very first copy.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, and now for the benefit of the rest of you in the audience, this is also the release day of that poster, and the Main Street program does have copies of it for sale at the back table after the presentation, as well as Cornerstone's DVD, Madison in the Movies, and Ron Grimes' book, pictorial book on Madison. If you don't have these in your Madison collection yet, your collection isn't complete. With that, I'd like to bring Marsh up here and turn the floor over to him.
Thank you, Rich. Well, thank you all for coming out on this nice snowy day. It's nicer down here than it was up north, but it's always a pleasure. I mean this most sincerely. I've always enjoyed coming to Madison through the years, and I see many old friends, hopefully some new friends here. I want to thank Rich Murray again for the invitation to be here. Mayor Huntington, thank you again for being here today. I see John Stacer in the back, my partner, who is the head of Historic Madison Incorporated. And I also want to acknowledge our man in Southern Indiana, Greg Sekula, who is the director of the Southern Regional Office of Historic Landmarks Foundation of Indiana in Jeffersonville, who spends a lot of time here in Madison. If you don't know Greg, you should, and so get to know him by the end of the day. I should ask how many people are members of Historic Landmarks Foundation? No? Pretty good. And those of you who are members of Cornerstone are members of Historic Landmarks Foundation by way of our affiliation with you all. Well, I've been asked to talk about the significance of the National Historic Landmark designation. Now, some of you may have been in the audience about a few months ago. I was asked to do a similar thing at Clifty Falls for Historic Madison. That was in November of '05. So I'll not repeat all of that, but there's some points I think that are relevant to the discussion today. But really, the point that I think I'm expected to address is to discuss how important local action is with respect to the national designation. What you have to do at the local level to it. You've already achieved the national designation, but what do you have to do now that you are so honored and burdened with this great title of a National Historic Landmark? But first, I want to thank Cornerstone Society for not only having this program, but for your support of historic preservation through the years. I know you're sometimes characterized as strident, outspoken, probably annoying to some, but you have contributed really immeasurably to the preservation of Madison's heritage. And we at Historic Landmarks Foundation are very proud to have you as affiliates of ours, partners in this venture we call historic preservation. Just a brief definition. I think you've probably heard this about 30 times by now with all the hoopla around the National Historic Landmark designation. But what is a National Historic Landmark? The official language is a National Historic Landmark is a building, a site, district, a structure, or an object that has been determined by the Secretary of the Interior to be nationally significant in American history and culture. Such examples include places like Mount Vernon, Pearl Harbor, Alcatraz Island, and the Martin Luther King birthplace, all very significant, well-known places. And Madison is certainly deserving of its place in the ranks of other places like that. A National Historic Landmark must possess exceptional value or quality in illustrating or interpreting the heritage of the United States in history, architecture, or archaeology. And if you want me to go further into this, talk to me afterwards. I've got the whole Park Service definition and sub-definitions in my briefcase, and we're happy to go into that further. There are fewer, you should know, fewer than 2,500 National Historic Landmarks nationally. This is a very rarefied honor, and there are only 37 in Indiana. And as I understand it, I believe this is true, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, Madison's historic district is the largest National Historic Landmark district ever. Is that correct?
I'd like to say that, but...
It is, yes, good. Say yes. You didn't hear it from John. Huh? This is the media microphone. I got to be careful. When I spoke to John's meeting back in November of 2005, I made what I thought was a joke. I know a couple of people thought it was funny, but it was the NHL designation had not been accepted yet. It was almost there, but not quite. And the Bush administration was going through some turmoil, even then, much as they are today, but there was a lot of concern about the competence of various departments in the Bush administration, and I made the comment that if the Department of the Interior does not make this a National Historic Landmark, that there ought to be they ought to be investigated for criminal stupidity. Well, in the Madison Courier printed that as a very serious comment, and it didn't say Davis joked. You know, it said, no, he said. And I thought, well, there goes the nomination. They're going to love me in Madison, and I'll never be able to deal with the Park Service again. But fortunately, it was the last line in the article, and hopefully, with all respect to the local newspaper, maybe no one from the government read that far into the article, but survived that one. Madison's listing amongst the National Historic Landmarks is described as follows. The Madison Historic District contains, you all know this? Have you read this before? Do you know? How many people have heard this language? I mean, you don't mind hearing it again? Okay, the Madison Historic District contains impressive numbers of significant buildings from the 19th and early 20th centuries, many in the Federal, Greek Revival, and Italianate styles. Mansions, row houses, and shotgun working houses represent all socioeconomic groups. The range of domestic, commercial, public, religious, and industrial buildings reflects small-town America. Remarkably, 19th century infrastructure, including culverts, retaining walls, curbs, and gutters, bridges, road grades, and alignments, survive. The district also includes houses identified with Underground Railroad activities. So, I mean, the point there is it's not just the buildings, but this cohesive whole, including the details, even gutters, are considered an important part of this designation. So it's this cohesive whole that constitutes the significance of this town. Retaining the National Historic Landmark designation, which is not a permanent thing, it can be taken away if there's a significant loss of historic fabric or loss of integrity or unsympathetic new development and other things that would encroach upon the historic character. In other words, don't take it for granted that you're always going to have this distinction. Protecting the historic character of this town is essential. The challenge, one of the challenges that Madison faces is the fact that this is such a large district. If not the largest, it's pretty darn big, and it contains a variety of components that you're not going to find in a typical neighborhood designation or a downtown commercial designation. You got the whole town basically in here, so there's a lot of things to consider in this. And as the Park Service states, the challenge comes in addressing these myriad remarkable details, not just the buildings. Now, a key player in protecting the character of the significance of historic Madison is historic Madison, the town, not protecting John Stacer, but protecting the character of this historic city is the Madison Historic District Board of Review, or as you call it, the Review Board. Some of us call it the Commission, but I'll try to stick with Review Board as the name for that body. So let me ask, I think I know the answer, but how many people here support the idea of having local designation, having a local review board? Is there anyone that does, don't be afraid, is there anyone that objects to having a local review board or thinks it's a bad idea? Nobody? Now you know that review board isn't here. There'd be a couple hands, I think. Well, that helps me because I know for certain now that I kind of thought I would be, but I'm absolutely certain now that I am, to some extent, preaching to the choir, so I need not belabor a lot of points. But let me offer some observations on Madison and on the Historic District Ordinance overlay, or the ordinance, and to some extent on the review board from my distant perspective. And again, please trust me, I have no vested personal interest in any of these comments. This is not in any sense a negative reflection. If I say something or illustrate something that might hit close to home, it's unintended. I'm speaking from a very objective standpoint when I talk about this, because I've had no personal interaction whatsoever with the review board here. What we have in Madison presently, the ordinance functions as the de facto design guidelines. It's a problem not just for the review board members, but really the bigger problem for the property owners who have to make sense of the ordinance and who are, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, but really it's got to serve both. It's got to serve the review board itself. The ordinance has to serve the review board and the public, the property owners. The ordinance states its purpose as being, quote, for the welfare of the citizens of the state, the city, the state, and the nation. Well, some may not like it, but people beyond Madison have a stake in the preservation of this community. And we should. It is, in fact, a national treasure. You can't deny it. I mean, even if you don't like it, you cannot deny that this place is of extraordinary importance to our nation. Certainly, from a statewide perspective, it plays a major role in what we do in historic preservation. It has set the standard in many ways. People know about it. They know that this is a place that people can come and experience authentic 19th and early 20th century heritage. And that's something that we all have a stake in, both as beneficiaries of it and those who need to work with you in protecting those qualities. Another thing about your ordinance, yours may be the only one in the nation that defines one of its boundaries as, quote, the toe of the hill. Now, is that different than the foot of the hill, or where is the northern boundary is defined as the toe of the hill, and I found that charming. But as I understand it, there are some concerns here about the effectiveness of Madison's review board and their ability to carry out the preservation of historic resources. Am I right in that? Is there any? It is a matter of concern that the review board is perhaps not functioning as well as it could. And no fault to the review board, because we're going to talk about some of the reasons that may be. And from my perspective, again, from an objective, distant perspective, here are the issues, some of the issues as I see them. Number one, the review board too often approves changes that are detrimental to the historic fabric and thus to the National Historic Landmark status of Madison. Is that true? Too often things are approved, we think, that shouldn't be. Second issue, the review board does not always act consistently in its findings. Is that right? And how can you fault them? They're working without design guidelines. Beyond what's written in language written in the ordinance. Which brings me to issue 3. There are no design guidelines. And it's amazing that there is no first-rate, top-quality set of design guidelines for a city like Madison. This of all places. Fourth issue, I mean, I am correct. There are no design guidelines, right? I mean, they're not hidden somewhere. We're talking about a map that might exist somewhere. Link, you've got a copy of them?
Well, there is a set of 10 or 12 design standards within the ordinance, but...
No, yeah, right. Beyond the ordinance, there are no design guidelines. Right. And the fourth issue is that there is inadequate enforcement. Is that also true? People do things and get away with it. And this is not unique to Madison. It's just that you've got such an extraordinary community here, and we think that if any place a review board ought to be working and effective, we would hope it'd be in a town that's just so rich in character and is the only national historic landmark of this type in our state. So if I may just very basically illustrate some of these points by way of modern technology, which I'm completely at sea in. Madison, as I said, is held to a higher standard. It's known nationally as a leader in historic preservation, largely through the Main Street program, or initially through the Main Street program, back in the 1970s. And the results, I think, have been quite good for the city of Madison. And it's famous, yes, for its wealth of historic resources, both the commercial and the residential. And it's not, as I said, it's not just the big architectural wonders such as the Shrewsbury House, but just as importantly, it's the expanse of vernacular architecture and the streetscapes, the neighborhoods, the gutters, and so forth. These are resources that are integrated one with another, not discrete, isolated landmarks. And preserving this is, in fact, a tall order. It takes political will, it takes financial commitment, and it takes constant vigilance. And so to illustrate some of the issues, those 4 points that I raised before, I'll show you just, again, briefly, with no intent to offend or make anyone uncomfortable, just some of the things that are happening here in Madison. It's a little bit fuzzy, but I think even with the fuzzy image, you can see that these replacement windows do not belong in that Italianate building, and these were actually installed, as I understand it, over the objection of the review board. There's good work. This is an example of somebody who did the right thing in a restoration, used the right materials, the right proportions, the right colors, sensitive to the details. Here's a trickier area that some of the ordinances around the country have tried to address with varying levels of success. But this gets into the issue of deferred maintenance, which can lead, if unarrested, can lead to demolition by neglect. You let problems go on too long, and this is where it gets kind of tricky and depends on how active the city administrations are in dealing with code enforcement issues. But something certainly in a city like Madison, which with all the historic resources, is to be attentive to potential building failures. Not that this is at that point yet, but you can begin to see some signs of it. Back to another good example, someone who did a fine restoration of a porch with the right materials and fabric, and same here, good restoration of the proper type of window sash installed, materials retained. Here's a case where the shutters are retained properly. Instead of having an aluminum or a plastic storm window, the owner is making wooden storm windows. I think that anyone would recognize this as something that's not desirable to have. I mean, vinyl siding and a window that doesn't even fit into that opening, standard size windows crammed into openings that are too large. A lot of this stuff, these are things that are happening here in Madison that are eroding the edges of your historic character, chipping away at that special quality that gives this place meaning. And it may not think, oh, what's the big deal? So the guy puts a wrong size window in. But you do that time and time again, and you're going to lose the essence of this place. Vinyl doors, another thing. I mean, and in this case, demolition by neglect, a little more obvious than what I showed before. This stuff really should not be happening in your district, and it will, over time, if allowed to accumulate, will jeopardize your standing as a National Historic Landmark, period. Here's an example of an old wooden window that looks kind of rough, but it is certainly repairable. And here's a case where someone locally has actually taken an old window, repaired it, and installed it as a replacement window, not using a modern window, but actually repairing an old window, recycling it, if you will, and putting it into a properly sized opening. There's the other solution, which we've already seen. Outside of Madison, just some more examples of what can happen when things get away from a review board, inappropriate enclosures of porches. Paint colors can be an issue. And at the very least, a landmark, and this is not Madison, but at the very least, a commission or review board, city staff should be able to serve as a resource for homeowners and property owners who are painting their properties. I'll tell a story on Link Ludington. Years ago, my wife and I had a house in Indianapolis. We painted it. Link probably doesn't remember this, but we painted our house, and it wasn't the best. It was much better than it was, but Link, it was kind of beige on brown and like three colors. So Link says, "Oh, you painted your house cafe au lait." And I felt like saying to Link what Dick Cheney told Senator Leahy, if you remember that, but I didn't. But he was right. Had I talked to someone like Link, he could have said, well, maybe you want to put just a little more color there or a little less brown here. It can be helpful. A little good advice from someone like Link or someone that has an eye, and preferably someone who is connected with the review board, can make a very positive difference. Nobody wants to have paint colors regulated until you get one of these in your neighborhood, and then everybody screams, "Can't you do something about it?" I guarantee it happens. And you probably get it a lot, John. People call you and say, "Stacey, what are you going to do about that?"
John Galvin gets those calls.
No, yeah. That's an obviously bad example. Then there's the issue of signs. Of course, your ordinance does cover signs in about 30 pages of sign details. This is one of those tricky things. What do we do with and this in the old days was clearly bad on the left, good on the right, but now we kind of come full cycle in our appreciation for signs from the 30s and 40s, and so it's kind of a dilemma, so I'll skip over that and not deal with it. No dilemma here. This is the bad thing. You don't want to do this, right? That's obvious. Now, I went through a similar experience with the National Historic Landmark and the potential loss of that designation when I was working in Galveston, which was as recently as August of this past year, where I was the director of the Galveston Historical Foundation. And in Galveston, we had 3 National Historic Landmarks, 2 districts, and one was a 19th century sailing ship, which was part of the foundation's properties. The East End Historical District was a mostly late 19th, a little bit early 20th century residential area. And then the downtown area, the equivalent of your Main Street, is a place called the Strand, which is basically about 5 blocks on 2 streets of commercial buildings, which was the major historic tourist destination in Galveston. People go to the Strand. And it's hard to take tourism lightly in a town like Galveston, and I think the same could be said in Madison. This is a tourist destination, and we studied this quite a bit in Texas. And I'm sure the statistics are similar because people are using the same currency, but the study that was done in Texas recently showed that for every $1 million spent on heritage tourism in Texas, 22 jobs are created, $480,000 of income is generated, $49,000 in state taxes are generated, $43,000 in local taxes are generated, and the gross state product increases by $825,000. This is out of people spending $1 million as heritage tourists. Also, heritage tourists or heritage visitors, if you prefer to call them that, they spend more money than just your basic non-heritage tourist, if you will. Nearly 25% more money they spend. And they're more inclined to stay overnight and pay for lodging as opposed to pass through or come and visit friends or relatives. The heritage visitors stay in your hotels more. They eat more food and more expensive food in your restaurants. This has been proven time and again that heritage tourism, of all forms of tourism, is good for a community. And it is the business, certainly in Galveston it was, to support heritage tourism. And it's important in Madison as well to support, unless the weather has changed in the last few years and people come here for the climate. I think most people come to Madison, probably come to visit the architecture or the heritage, the scenic landscape in and around the town. Back to Galveston, though, there was concern about the lax code enforcement that was happening in this historic area called the Strand. One day, shortly after I had started work there, the National Trust was visiting Galveston, and Peter Brink, who had been the director there a couple of decades earlier, was walking with me down the Strand. He said, you know, things are really getting a little loose down here. The standards are starting to decline. And it wasn't long after that I was walking on the Strand and was approached by someone who informed me that, did you know that our National Historic Landmark status is potentially threatened as defined by the National Park Service? And it was the first I'd heard of it. And of course I was not surprised because you could see this decline, this stuff at the edges going on. But you know who told me? It was not a preservationist. It was not a Landmark Commission member. It wasn't somebody from the National Park Service. This was a Strand merchant. This was a businessman who made his living as part of the life of the economy of the town. He was concerned about losing that designation of National Historic Landmark. So I inquired what that meant and found that there were three levels of evaluation that the National Park Service does every 2 years on the National Historic Landmarks. They rank them as being not threatened, potentially threatened, or threatened. And if you're threatened, you're really kind of on the edge of losing things. Well, we had moved from being okay into that potentially threatened area. And it created quite an uproar. Of course, we milked it for what it was worth. We got front page coverage in the news. We worked with the city. We got code enforcement to crack down, and we started enforcing some of the parts of the ordinance that had simply been let go. Things like storefronts that began to look like this. People were coming in and tacking stuff up in the windows, not maintaining their properties. We had a lot of property owners that, flat out building code violations where you can see the plants growing on the ledges, on the rooftops, not good for buildings, in some cases small trees. The backside of one of the historic buildings, this fire escape was just flapping in the breeze. Safety issues, not just aesthetic issues. And then we had a case actually of demolition by neglect, and found that spent a lot of time in City Council and at the Landmark Commission debating this. Lawyers were involved. Ultimately, the building came down. We lost a building in our National Historic Landmark District. Part of that precipitated then this potentially threatened designation by the Park Service. These were all little things that happened along the way. In the case of this building, which partially collapsed and ultimately had to be taken down, well, the building owner had just stacked it full of stuff. He used it as a warehouse in the back part, and it just couldn't sustain the weight. He also didn't maintain it. It was a lack of maintenance that led to demolition by neglect. So these were the issues that we had to deal with. And what I did was I met with the city planning office and we said, we've got to do something about this. We had the city manager involved. So our plan was to go out and tell all the property owners in the Strand that the city's going to start taking code enforcement seriously. And we were going to leave a little notice on their doors explaining the process. So what the city did, they went, instead of offering to inform people, they just went out the next Monday and started slapping $300 citations on everybody that was doing something wrong. And I said, no, this isn't what we had in mind. And of course, I was accused then of backpedaling and not going to the wall with code enforcement. But everyone was just, when you talk about phone calls that I got from the merchants who were getting these $300 fines. So I worked with one of the city council members, who's now the mayor of the city. We called a meeting, got everybody together, the planning staff, city council members, merchants, and we talked through it. We got the fines all rescinded and gave kind of a grace period. But I tell you, after that, once we got the city actively engaged in this, working with the Strand merchants, working with the Historical Foundation, there were clear and measurable results, and the next time around, we were removed from that potentially threatened designation. Now, it's not the designation that's that important, but it's the fact that we were losing stuff and our town was starting to look like a dump. That was the important thing, and that potentially threatened designation gave us the kick in the seat pants that we needed to move forward, and it was very helpful. As I said, we made as much hay out of it as we could. You don't need to go there, though, to do it. And just a reminder of demolition by neglect. A few years ago, Madison lost this humble, largely compromised but very historic building, the old St. Paul's Church, an important part of the African-American heritage, partially collapsed due to lack of maintenance, and then demolished without any permission from the review board, and no enforcement after that. So it can happen here, and has. So what do we do with these issues? And we look at these pictures and we see all those people that put those stupid windows in there, and we can, as preservationists, we sometimes look back, we criticize and we snicker, and sometimes we whine, or it makes us feel superior. Gee, what fool would do something like that? Because we get it and they don't. Well, I thought that this afternoon would not be a wasted venture if we could address at least one of those primary issues that I outlined before, those issues that are facing the ordinance and the effectiveness of the review board, and to approach this in a concrete way. So I'd like to focus the next few minutes on design guidelines, or as I said before, the amazing lack thereof here in Madison. Without design guidelines, your review board and Madison's property owners are mostly flying blind, and you can't fault them for being inconsistent many times. At its worst, the lack of design guidelines will allow for arbitrary and inconsistent decisions. It erodes the credibility of the review board, and it makes enforcement politically untenable. If you lack that clarity, these things will happen. The lack of design guidelines puts the burden of interpretation on the review board members. It fosters the easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission syndrome. And remember that the design guidelines are not just for the review board members, they're for the property owners as well, for they are the stewards of the historic properties of this city. The guidelines should illuminate, not obfuscate. They should illustrate in a graphic way examples that in a way that an ordinance with just words cannot. So imagine, if you will, if you're a homeowner, even somebody who wants to do the right thing, and you turn to the ordinance and you read, rhythm of solids to voids in front facades. The relationship of solids to voids in the front facade of a building shall be visually compatible with buildings, squares, and places to which it is visually related. Okay? Visually compatible. even if we can make sense of that sentence before, one man's visual compatibility may horrify someone else. So is a commission supposed to understand what visual compatibility is? It's like that often cited comment by the court saying they can't define pornography, but they know what it is when they see it. You can't necessarily, can you define visual compatibility, or do you just know it when you see it? I don't know. Or how about this on the sign dimensions? Imagine you're a property owner, you want to, what do I do? So, lacking guidelines, you turn to the ordinance. The length shall not exceed 2/3 of the width of the narrowest building face, and the height shall be no greater than 20% of the length unless otherwise approved by the board. This isn't exactly user-friendly. Madison needs design guidelines to make clear sense to property owners as well as review board members. I think I've probably belabored that, but that's, anybody disagree with that we need the guidelines? A few years ago, Historic Landmarks Foundation undertook a study of the effects of local designation on property values and the quality of life in locally designated historic districts in cities across Indiana. And in this methodology, what we did, we found places where there were historic districts immediately adjacent to non-historic districts, but districts basically containing the same types of resources. Now, you can't do that in Madison because you got the whole town, but several other cities offered good opportunities for comparing these two adjacent neighborhoods. And we found a number of things that I think support the work of local commissions and support the idea that we need local designation. First, we found the perception that historic preservation commissions or review boards, the perception that they are bureaucratic naysayers and dispensers of red tape and dispensers of worthless regulation is simply not true. In fact, a vast majority, over 90% of the applications considered by respective review boards were approved. And I think that's the case here in Madison, too, that people are not being unduly burdened by having a review board. They're approving most everything that goes through. If you add to that the positive effects of local designation, the property values increased more rapidly in locally designated areas than in non-designated areas, and the property values were more stable in historic districts, and that investment was more readily attracted to such areas. The case for local designation and a working commission is quite compelling. But the study's finding that is most relevant to us today in Madison is this. Historic districts have the greatest positive impact when the preservation commissions or the review boards have clear guidelines firmly and consistently applied and effectively communicated. All those things, property values, quality of life, retention of investment in the areas, these things work best when you have a local designation supported by an effective commission or review board that has clear guidelines and firmly and consistently applies them and communicates them. So what's a step toward that direction in Madison? The stakes here are higher, I would say, than in any other community in Indiana. But I wanted to leave today, I didn't want to leave here without taking some action. I can leave and take a nice picture back there, but I wanted to leave something here with you. And we at Historic Landmarks would like to offer you a way to get design guidelines in the community. And the way to do that is to come up with some funding for it. And so I'm going to commit to you that we will pay for, through one means or another, work with Cornerstone, with Madison, but Historic Landmarks Foundation will be responsible for bringing to the table sufficient funds to present to Madison professionally and properly prepared design guidelines so that your local landmark commission, your review board, can have a tool to work with. Thank you. I was pleased to have this conversation about this with Mayor Huntington and to get his support for this idea. I wouldn't want to do this without the city support, and you should know that he was entirely supportive of this idea and wants to work with us in coming up with guidelines that are well suited to this community. I mentioned as well to John Stacer, and I'm fully confident that HMI will be supportive of this as well. And of course, we want to work hand in hand with Cornerstone in making sure this happens. But that's what we would like. We would ask for simply the endorsement. We don't want to do this if the city and the review board are not going to buy into it, and the mayor has already been gracious enough to say, let's go with it. And we would like the blessing of both Cornerstone and Historic Madison, and their respectively their help in putting this to work in the community, helping to disseminate it, helping to put a positive spin on both the need for it and how effective these things can be. After that, if we're successful, and I believe that I have no reason to believe that we will not be successful in the next few months coming up with the funding. And I'm talking about at least 10,000, maybe 20,000, maybe more than that to get this done right, and to print the guidelines and make them available to the community. So this is a significant commitment on our part. But when this is done, I would like for the city also to consider, with guidance from Historic Landmarks Foundation, that the review board be aided by at least a part-time preservation professional to help implement the guidelines and to help disseminate them. This is something that we'll get to down the road, but I think with guidelines in place, communities are best served when there is an objective preservation professional who can work hand in hand with the volunteer review board members. These people do serve. It's a thankless task being on a review board, so you've got to give these people credit for the work that they do. I wonder why people do it sometimes. They get beat up quite a bit, but it's great when they have support from the city by way of professional support, and it's a way for us all to work together. So I see this as a way to move forward for the sake of helping the review board, for the sake of bringing Cornerstone and the Historic Madison and Historic Landmarks Foundation, bring our forces together to assist the city, offer what we can, but more importantly, to present something to you that will, I believe, make a big step forward in the protection of the great historic resources that you have here, so that you don't have to find yourself potentially threatened in your National Historic Landmark designation. This is something I think we can do, I know we can do, and we're committed to doing it, and look forward to doing it with you. Thank you. I got so engrossed in my reading, which I don't particularly prefer to do, but I reviewed some of the publicity that you've received in the review board issues in the past, and also this idea of guidelines that are graphic and user-friendly. These are some of my favorites. Just one example from Greencastle, Indiana, done years ago, but still very well done, that a business owner or homeowner can look at and understand a lot more easily than the language that I quoted you from the ordinance. It may say the same thing, but it says it in a way that we can understand it. And I'm kind of visual, and I think a lot of this thing we call historic preservation is quite a visual undertaking. So this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about, illustrating the points that contained, illustrating and elaborating on the intent and purpose of the ordinance itself for the sake of this wonderful community. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, speaking on behalf of Cornerstone Society, and I think I can probably also speak for HMI and the city, we want to thank you for your offer, Marsh. This can be very important for the city, and you've made the offer. It's up to us now to follow up and help you make sure it gets done. Thank you very much.